Good evening, guys. Can I get a good evening? Thank you. So when Mariam said that this discussion was going to be on policy, I saw all the faces going, another policy discussion. So we'll try to keep this upbeat. You know why? You guys are entrepreneurs here, wanting to succeed, and sometimes we need support from our enabling environment. And that's what we're going to talk about. The policies and strategies in this country, policies and strategies which have worked on the countries that Glenn has been to. So let's see, let's engage, because this could be a time that you could really ask the right questions. Why? Because the guy who sits on the Iron Throne is right here. That's Anushka Vijayasinghe. He's the driver. That's Anushka. He's the driver behind, sitting at ModSit, behind the entrepreneurship and innovation strategy, and a lot of things. And thankfully, there's a young guy who understands entrepreneurs, who understands innovation, and we are really thankful that he's there. Don't move to anywhere else, please. Okay, let's start. We've got 44 minutes.
Hello. Is it my cologne, or are you sitting? Why are you sitting so
sorry.
far from me?
So this is for Casper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Casper sitting there.
That's the
Okay,
invisible policy guy. Okay. Checking.
So we'll start with understanding our context. So there was a few new strategies that were introduced during the past few months. The National Export Strategy and Innovation and Entrepreneurship strategy is on the way. There was the Enterprise Sri Lanka, and so many things which are coming on. First question to Anushka. Why a strategy now? Was there something missing?
Thanks, Sachindra, and really great to be with all of you at another edition of Disrupt Asia. Congrats to ICT and your team.
Thank you.
I'm a little mindful of this Iron Throne. It sounds bulky, heavy to move around, and difficult to get out of. So
because Mangal is next to you and winter is coming.
But I think on a serious note, one of the reasons why we're seeing some of these strategies come out now is that for several years, Sri Lanka's growth model was dominated by building stuff, right? Putting concrete on the ground, infrastructure, and that too public infrastructure, and that too debt-fueled public infrastructure.
Yeah.
So change in this model to a model that's driven by people like you, by entrepreneurs, by trade and investment, by startups, by the private sector, is that shift that needed to happen. And to make that shift happen, one of the things that need to change the most or most dramatically is how the government as a whole, and that whole machinery that entails, views this change. And if there is no alignment in terms of government and this agenda, then we achieve nothing. So the one thing, the one thing above all else that these strategies do, and I'm very realistic, it's all of the entrepreneurs who are actually going to change the game in Sri Lanka. It's not the government. But what these strategies do is that it focuses people's minds on the things that really need to be done and can be done to make that step change and to move the needle. Yeah. So I think that is why it's important right now to have these strategies.
It's a really good point, focusing on the things that matter.
Right on stage.
Which could also mean that maybe we have focused on things that didn't matter all this time. And because of a strategy, we are aligning ourselves. So Glenn, with your experience around the world, you would have some examples on how carefully crafted strategies would have really impacted the ecosystems. Can you give us a few examples of what you know?
Sure, and I mentioned a couple in my talk. The one that's top of mind, excuse me, for me is what created the Austin ecosystem. I think that the advantage to the strategy that the Texas government and the government of the city of Austin took was, we're going to empower it and leave it a bit alone. In other words, we know that we're not innovators, really. That's not our charge, that's not our profile, it's not our background. And there are other experts in the market that are, but those experts and the startups that they're working with need help. And so the policy was sort of a framework around which then the other members of the successful commercialization ecosystem that I talked about a minute ago could then build, right? So on that foundation, they built that building. In the case of the government of Andhra Pradesh, another good example, so the Honorable Chief Minister had a dream. He had a vision to create a global innovation ecosystem and birth one entrepreneur per family. So in other words, to energize youth to think about entrepreneurship as a way to create jobs and wealth. And that policy document is sort of the consciousness of the state that says, it's a touch point. Are we doing what we said? If we go back to the document, are we there? Are we getting off track? If we're getting off track, which is bound to happen, then we can go back and either revise what we're doing or revise the strategy, right? It's sort of like a business plan. As soon as y'all write a business plan, it's obsolete. Why? Not because you're not good writers, but because the market shifts. Same thing will happen in a developing innovation ecosystem. And so the policy documents are sort of the touchstone, as it were, the corporate consciousness to go back to say, are we really doing it correctly, or do we need to modify? And how have we done? It's also a way to establish metrics. And we've seen this in South Korea, we've seen this in Chile, we've seen this in Mexico, we've seen this in 42 countries around the world. The same kind of an approach is as and when government goes in with an open hand, and by an open hand I mean an interest in supporting, but then allowing others to do their roles, success. When it's heavy-handed, the runway is quite long, I'll say. And so you need to be careful
to take the back seat when required, and then coming and input or intervene at points which are required.
Right, exactly.
Mangala, you've been an entrepreneur and been through a decade of working in a company in the US and in Sri Lanka. What has your experience been with policies and strategies, and has that affected you in some form?
Yeah, so when Sachindra asked me to join this panel, Anushka, on policy and strategy, I said, Sachi, I cringe when I hear those words. I don't want to be on it. But then I think it's a setup. That's why he wants me. I mean, and then I was sent about 300 pages of documentation to read. So I spent yesterday at home reading all that. So to begin, they were brilliantly done. So
I should intervene. The document that Mangala is talking about is a draft version of the Innovation and Entrepreneurship strategy, which is being carefully crafted with the leadership of MODSIT and the Chamber of
Minister of Science, Technology, Industry and Commerce.
Many other stakeholders, including the private sector, which we all read to prepare ourselves to know what's in the content which will affect you. So it will be made a public document when the consultation periods are done. That's the document which Mangala is talking about.
I mean, it's covers a lot of ground, very detailed, and so as when you ask like our experience, so that's I'm going to touch that. So in terms of coverage, all that's beautifully done. Everything I want to hear was there. So I'm always impatient. That's where I come into. So the good news is it's an excellent document. Here comes the but. So whether we like it or not, we are a democratic country. We have 5-year election cycles. So what happens when you take 3.5 years to create the document, and look at the state of trade,
One year.
Well, I'm looking at the election cycle.
Man. It's 1 year.
I'm looking at the election cycle, right? So
I think we need a referee up here, I'm not sure.
I mean, Trace,
You're the arbitrator.
you probably don't know. I mean, this place has not progressed during last 3.5 years because it's the previous guy's work.
Yeah.
So now this is this guy's work. When the next election happens, the next guy is not going to do anything because it's this guy's work. So that's where I'm impatient. I want the way I look at it is we are software developers, so we look at Agile and Scrum. So we get shit done in sprints. So there should be like 5 sprints, 1 5-year sprint. First sprint, you get the documentation done 1 year, and then you have 4 more years, 4 sprints to make progress. And then when you're done with the 5th sprint, you get re-elected. I'm not.
So I'm going to intervene. So this is to you, mediator. So we have.
I'm not even done, but.
So we have the guy.
I'm not getting paid to mediate here. I don't know about that.
So we have Anushka, who's trying really hard to work in a.
Brilliant guy. We
bureaucratic
need more
setting.
of you guys. I mean, that's nothing against you, man. Okay. Yeah.
So none was taken. No offense taken.
Don't take it personal.
Let me bring it up a level here. And you guys can go duke it out back afterwards. But I wanted to just add another sort of component where I think public policy is helpful, and this is history. So in 1960, well, prior to 1960, the government, any research project that was funded by government monies resulted in the intellectual property belonging to the government. And that caused no end of heartburn for universities, for small and medium-sized enterprises who might be benefiting from government grants, because they were hamstrung. Their hands were tied because they couldn't do much with technology that was owned by a government entity which was not very adept in commercializing things. And so in 1960, 2 senators whose last names were Bai and Dole, Birch Bai and Robert Dole, introduced a bill which became law, signed by Jimmy Carter in 1960, called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act said, even though governments fund technology development, those who develop the technologies have the opportunity and the option to commercialize the same. And that revolutionized industries, that revolutionized startup environments, that revolutionized an entire culture, because all of a sudden I could actually go and make money based on technology in which I had sweat equity, but which the government was not allowing me heretofore to really receive remuneration. And so that's an area where government policy can really help to enable processes that help entrepreneurs and research centers and universities be more successful. So.
I should add into that, because for so many years, so the IT industry in Sri Lanka started off many years back, and we got noticed recently. Through the National Export Strategy, there's a separate section for IT BPM, and innovation and entrepreneurship is a horizontal, is a pillar that it's based on. I would say that should be commended on. Where it needs to be commended, it should be commended on that the government, in terms of policy, has made this right move. But when going forward, so Anushka has so many things to say in terms of hope which is out there. We can look at whether that hope will be fulfilled. In terms of regulation changes, share with us, Anushka, what are the regulation changes and those that we can hope for as entrepreneurs that we can look forward to through the strategy?
So this is one of the things, Sachin, that encourages me about this strategy, because I'm like all of you, right? I'm relatively new to government. I was very impatient, but I think when you're in government, you have to be a little more patient because things move at a different pace. It's the same thing, right? So this is getting this strategy out really is the first step, or even pre-first step.
Yeah.
What are we going to do on Monday morning? And this is the kind of stuff that, because the strategy was co-created with the private sector, with startups, with angel investor platforms, that really helped us identify what are the things that will move the needle.
Yeah.
Because all this time, I would argue that, yes, this strategy is coming out, but a lot of institutions, ICTA, Technology and Research Ministry, all of them have been doing stuff, but I feel that's been tinkering on the margin. And you've had this startup ecosystem flourish pretty much regardless of that. So then we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that will really move the needle that government has to do that no one else can do? It's like street lighting, for example. What are those things that we have to do that no one person is really willing to pay for, but will have across the board benefits? The regulatory reforms was one piece that came out very strongly, and in the strategy, in the startups pillar, which is the third one, identifying business regulations and business climate issues that hold startups back has been identified as one. And one of the key things that we are hoping to push first is some of the issues, for example, with the Companies Act that hurt attracting venture capital. Other is around payments, but that stuff has already begun. Hopefully will get catalyzed through this work with Central Bank. But I think the broader message here, and this links to something Glenn said as well, and to Mangala's impatience, we need people like Mangala to keep us honest. Yeah. Because if we put this strategy out, and we have, yes, we've identified a plan of action, yes, we've identified priority actions in year one, but who's going to keep us honest? Who's going to hold the government accountable and say, you promised to deal with these priority actions, what's happening? But this is where we need, it's not just about accountability in terms of pointing fingers, but also being part of that process. I really like Glenn's slides around collaboration and co-creation. I think in this accountability game, the more we have the private sector, whether it's large companies or startups, being part of helping to create the solution, the more likely we are to get stuff done. Because too often we see animosity between government and the rest, where it's just about the problems, finding fault. And now being in government, what I realize is, I know you guys have a lot of issues with a lot of regulations, but trust me, most of the time the government doesn't even know that these are hurting you. Most of the time these have slipped under the radar for so many years. I'll give you an example without mentioning a company. There is a wood products, a startup that uses wood products to make a lifestyle, a fashion accessory. Because it's wood, naturally, you get into all kinds of regulations. And there's obviously one department in government that regulates wood products to see sustainability, where it was sourced. Right. Now, this company has, wants to sell through e-commerce, which means you're retailing out of Sri Lanka. But the regulations are such that they have been architected in an era where that was not a business model. So you send shipments of wood stuff, which means you get the license per shipment. So then you have a guy who wants to send one product today to fulfill an order in the UK, maybe 3 products tomorrow to Australia. These are now individual, and it's a whole, now this business model is at odds with the regulatory landscape. It's only through having these platforms, and the strategy enables that we are able to listen to them and solve the problems. Because if you think that government can proactively figure out what do you guys need, what are the regulations that are hurting, I mean, that's a pipe dream. Yeah. The only way we can begin to fix the problems is by having platforms to reveal the problem. Government commits to saying, okay, if you reveal the problem, we will help fix it. But also the private sector coming on board as a partner to say, here are the steps in which you need to get it done. And I'll give you examples, I won't give you examples, but I can tell you from the apparel industry, the reason they got to where they are now is that they were very organized in how they requested for regulatory policy changes. They were very credible and clear in what they requested, sometimes going to the extent of suggesting the regulatory language that should come in, suggesting the legal redrafting of a particular law. And with all the stuff that people like legal draftsmen have to do today, when you give that to them, it's really easy for government to pick it up, put it to cabinet, get it done. So I think, yes, use the strategy and the action plan to hold us accountable, to say, you promised to do this, you need to do it, what's happened, it's been 6 months. But also to say, we like what you see here, we have a solution, can we work together to help solve it? Because we don't think you, Mr. Government, really knows the solution to this, but we can come in together and cause a solution. So I think that's what we really need to focus on.
Just to put a spanner in the works. Now, you said that the ecosystem was growing without much support from the government, and there were certain things happening in separate places. Mangala, now the ecosystem was growing. Should the government be intervening based on what Glenn was saying, where they should step back or step in at certain times? Do you think the government should be intervening in an ecosystem which is anyway growing at a certain pace and certain things are happening? Should the government intervene at all?
No, I think...
I'm also government, by the way, so
some
of the work is there.
So I think we are on the same page, because I believe the government's job, it's an enabler, right? So government, there's fundamental things government could do, and then they should stay away. like the infrastructure, the defense, the healthcare, the education, that's the fundamentals. And then I was going to actually ask you, Anushka, the predictability. That's very important for us. We sign contracts, sometimes multi-year contracts, and then next year we find out, oh, we are taxed 14%, 16%, but we can't go and change our contracts based on government waking up every budget cycle and changing. So those are the things that really as the entrepreneurs of the private sector can't do. So the fundamental infrastructure, the basics, and then the enabling, and of course, when you look at as a country, say, ease of doing index, there are certain things, if you want to go up in that index, of course, the private sector can't improve that alone. Yeah. That's where the government could come in, a lot of permit issues, I mean, you know all that. So I think that's, so this document goes really the right direction. It's very progressive, but it's a document. We need to make it happen.
There's another way, and I absolutely agree with what you've said. There might be one other thing to expand upon that the government could do to assist. As I mentioned, we've operated in 42 countries around the world, and invariably what the government says to us is, we should be the best customer for your technologies. And that's a really nice phrase, sounds really good, would love it to happen, but oftentimes the structure of government doesn't necessarily enable that to work. And that's an area where, again, back to the Austin model, Austin, we have the same problem in the US as everywhere else. The government of Austin took the approach, we understand that. We understand that we're not very well positioned to be customers, and so we want to figure out what being a customer means, right? And that's led over time, and it isn't like add water and stir, it's not one day to the next. It was an evolution of discussions and more people from the ecosystem getting involved, and tiger teams and task forces addressing it. But today, you've got an example of Austin Electric. It's the electric power provider for the city of Austin. Austin Electric has a relationship with the Austin Technology Incubator. In fact, they put some funding into ATI for operating capital with a view to having the right of first refusal on some of the technologies that might come through which could help them solve problems. So in other words, now the process is there, there's skin in the game, they've put money in directly into a highly leveraged operation that's churning out disruptive technologies, and the city in some cases is buying them. If they don't buy them, they promote them, or they help them get into a test bed where they can be evaluated for further commercialization. And so over time, sort of the policy has become practice. And I think that's what you're talking about, is take the policy and put it into practice. And if you do, then it works. And I think that, and there are many cases, by the way, all the guys here in the audience, don't get too excited the government's going to buy all my products. It needs to be applicable to but this is where the triple helix becomes important. Because if academia, which is developing the techs, is talking to industry about what problems the industry wants to solve, the government gets involved and says, hey, we have problems, societal problems we've got to solve, and maybe all three of us can get together, and then another portion of the quadruple helix is venture capital and civil societies that say, okay, now here's a way to fund it, to take it from 35,000 feet to ground. Then you've got an ecosystem underwritten by policies and procedures that then works.
So from what Anushka says, there is a lot of effort being put into crafting these policies. But if I ask the audience, how many of you know here that there is a national export strategy? Can I see a raise of hands? Okay, that's about 50% of the audience. How many of you know, I'm not sure whether it's a fair question to ask, that there is a innovation and entrepreneurship strategy being drafted? Okay, certain amount. Anushka, what is the communication strategy behind this? How do we communicate it to the beneficiaries and how they can align themselves with these strategies, where some might not know that there's a strategy which exists? How do we communicate this back to the government who's going to come on board to implement the strategy? What are your thoughts on that?
So that's really important, Sanjay, because so both with the NES and the INE, more so with the NES because it had wider stakeholders involved, a lot of the key stakeholders kind of know already because there were about 500 folks from the private sector who were involved. With the INE strategy, it was less so, given that it didn't have a sectoral focus and it didn't have all of that. So the folks who have been in the consultations kind of know. In terms of communication, let's say on day one when we get cabinet approval and so on, I think our focus will be more inward. We will put it out. I think all of you will pick it up and look at it. We'll try and make it as bite-sized as possible. But our real immediate focus is going to be taking it inward and making sure that the key agencies that need to do something with it are aligned. Because I think that's the only way we can deliver some results. What we've tried to do already, because as Mangala said, you know, it takes years to develop some of these things. The strategy itself took a year, which is relatively short for government, but like you said, it's 3 years into a term of a government. So what we did was last year, even while the strategy was being formulated, because of the things we heard from the stakeholders, from the startup community, from SMEs, from R&D institutions, and so on, we put in a request to the budget last year, and we actually got money to do some pilots. For example, one is we recognize that for smaller companies to be able to, startups, smaller companies, medium-sized companies, whoever, for them to break into a new market overseas, it's very difficult, particularly from product standards, quality certification, testing. We don't have a lot of testing labs if you're a product company. Breaking into a new market, finding partners, doing due diligence, market research. Those are things that often hinder a new company from going global quicker. Right. And that's why it sometimes takes longer unless, of course, you're in, let's say, software. So,
but I'm not sure that the government's role is to set up labs to help.
We're not setting up labs.
It's different stakeholders.
So it's not at all. Yeah. We are giving money to the startups to go and buy those services from whoever they want. Because we know that for us to set up labs, it's going to take all of these procurement issues and so on. So as a second best solution, we are saying, you may have wanted to do that 5 years from now or 3 years from now. Can we help you to do it today? Can we help you to buy that expensive piece of kit or that lab test or quality certification? So that's one thing that we launched.
So do you, just sorry to interrupt, but do you have I don't mean to take over your panel, but I'm really curious. Do you have a process, an application process through which folks like this could apply for government funds to subsidize certain aspects of the development of their company, whether that be from 1.0 to 2.0 or from prototype to market ready, or even funding commercialization processes? I'm not talking about market analysis, I'm talking about taking products to market through hard resources. Is there an effort like that that's clearly understood by entrepreneurs to which they can apply?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the first, if you read the strategy, the draft strategy, and even though it's draft, I'm happy to share with whoever who wants it bilaterally. One of the things that was recognized is the need for this, and that's why we launched the scheme. In this, you apply through, for government procedures, it's a relatively easy application, and you can get anything under 5 million rupees if you're a smaller company for the first window. And in this, the next window, which hasn't been launched yet, is called the Enterprise Innovation Program. Yeah. You could get up to 22 or 24 million rupees. That's for more transformative, either product innovation or process innovation.
And how are those applications reviewed?
We have about 166 applications received now for the first window. And there are 2 steps. For the smaller ticket sizes, it's internal and it's quick. For the larger ticket sizes, under the first window, we have a couple of experts who we draw on to see if, to vet it. Yeah. For the larger ticket one, we're setting up an investment committee which will look at it more rigorously.
Just out of curiosity, how many here are aware of that process and have seen it work?
It's
not too many.
It's
new?
3 weeks old.
Oh, well, what's the problem? It's been out there 3 weeks. What are you guys doing? Get involved.
So a side note here, it was published in the papers and it was published online. The forms are downloadable. And and I give you this commitment, if at any time when you're filling those forms or when you're making the submission or you're being vetted, if you feel that this is not startup friendly, tell me and I will deal with it personally, because in the design of this, again for the first time, and thanks to interventions by many of you, we brought in startups into the room to tell us, we had this old scheme that was not really friendly, tell us how we can change it. And we had lots of startups who gave really good input. Some things, because of government procurement rules, we couldn't fully change, but I think we made it a lot more startup friendly. But if you still feel it's not working, please tell us.
Sachin, let me ask him two questions too. Now, does this so I mean, some of the problems, like I mentioned, like the predictability and then the regulation, that kind of stuff, is it baked into this policy, Anushka? One question. And then the other one, I mean, I saw a action plan in it, but what I think is, it's really, to make it happen, we should have like who owns it, when it's due, who gets fired if it's not delivered. That kind of really, I mean, you have to put people responsible for that. This is government, right? But
So maybe just answer the accountability question, and then I'll open up to the audience.
Yeah, sure. I think on the accountability question, I really don't know don't set your expectation about anyone getting fired over not implementing this. I'll be completely honest.
Will they get a promotion?
But you're right. We would all like to see that. But in terms of timelines and milestones and key deliverables, that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's probably what we're building in this final stage of finalizing it.
Yeah.
And also identifying actual implementer. For example, if it's a payments regulation, CBSL, and so on. And the advantage is that when you have this and it's adopted by cabinet, it kind of escalates it. And you have a mechanism in which to ask the implementing agency, you had this one activity to do in Q1 of 2019. How is that going? At least, and hold, keep a fire under the...
So they understand the predictability is important.
So this is where, Mangal, I'm on the same page with you. So particularly on tax, because it's a strategy and not a part, it's not a, let's say, a broad-based policy. It's not like the income tax policy, Income Tax Act or something like that. This strategy cannot assure you that the tax rate is not going to change, for example. But I think with stuff like this, we want the government to have a much better appreciation of the negative impacts it has on startups and this ecosystem, and hopefully it'll be somewhat of a deterrent.
Yeah, so that was an important note. What can the policy do? What will it do, or what won't it do? Sorry about this. We have about 6 minutes more. I know the questions are usually from the audience to the panelists. So we've been asking questions from each other. Back to the audience. I'm sure you have some burning questions which would have been pain points for your startup. Now's the time to shoot your panelists. Can we have the mics going around? We have a question here.
Hi, good evening. The first question is about the communication and sharing the information with the startups. You mentioned quite a few things that you guys are doing part of the strategy and things that are already implemented. What I want to know is, what are the channels that are available for the startups to go in and get this information? Do we need to go through some connection to the government to get the information, or do we need to establish some real close relationships with certain channels to get that? So I'm talking from experience. There are a couple of instances where we need to start certain things. To get the information was one difficulty that we faced. Second thing was to understand the regulations that are surrounding in the industry that we want to get into as part of the startup. Third thing is, or worse, on the financial part of it, getting a bank account opened up required like zillion documents and required half a day at the bank. What are these things as part of the things being considered as part of the strategy that you mentioned, or is there some kind of a plan to address them?
So, could you repeat your second question? What was the second area you said?
First area was
Communication was
The
first.
communication, how you can apply. Third
this-
was about banks. Second was?
Second was...
So let's answer those two.
That's
which
okay.
we know.
Until
That's
you
okay.
remember the second one. On the first, www.srilankabusiness.com, that's the site of the Export Development Board. It's not only open for exporters. We're using that as the implementing agency because that is the implementing arm, the agency that we have. You go to that homepage, it says Market Access Support Program. Download the application forms. You can submit application forms online as well if you prefer that. And this is, you know, all of this is open, all the instructions are there. By the way, as a side note, because I know the skepticism you have about government schemes. In this one, because we had technical input for the strategy, we had technical input from the World Bank, we actually asked them to help us develop a best practice grant manual. That is what we use, which is more user-friendly, and we make sure it fast-tracked. But also on the application, we had input from them to make sure that it's a simpler form. So I hope it is. Remember that there are government procedures, so we couldn't make it as easy as a Google form, but we hope it's more startup friendly. Your third point about bank financing, this is an area that came up, and we are hoping that we can't solve in the strategies. For example, we can't instruct banks to do something different, but we're hoping that once this, because it's one of the items, this business-friendlier regulations and procedures is one of the areas, that once the strategy is adopted by Cabinet, we can get banks around the table along with startups, or at least ecosystem supporters, and have that discussion so that they understand it. Because I can tell you that it's easy for banks to be able to retain their existing procedures because there hasn't been a push. But once, and there is a national strategy adopted where all stakeholders are expected to align, we can then begin to have that conversation where they're asked to relook at their procedures, and hopefully all of you will contribute to what that should look like. How should a new bank application form, loan appraisal for a startup look like, for example?
Thank you.
Another question there? Two questions.
Hi, my name is Dileepa, and thank you for elaborating on the options that are available from the government. Mine is one question and two suggestions probably. The question, could you elaborate a little more on what's on offer on Window 1? To me, that wasn't too clear. Second is, since you're working with startups, are you all having any strategies to mark, or rather showcase what is available through more startup-friendly channels, whether it is YouTube viral videos or whether it's Facebook, because a newspaper ad the old way will not penetrate to most of us. So hopefully that's there. If not, can you kindly do that? And secondly, maybe connecting to what Mangala said, one thing the government, I see a lot of things good policy level happening through the government. But having said that, if it's not sold well or shown to the public, the next election comes and you have done great work, but then you have a new government. So maybe you can learn from the previous government. They were good at marketing what they did and what they didn't do as well. And no offense to any government, whatever you are doing good, it's good, market it. Whatever you are doing bad, take the hit for it. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Was there a question there?
Could you elaborate on the Window 1 as to what you are really offering? I don't think that was too clear. At least for me. Thank you.
Question on Window 1.
So, to remind, Window 1 is the first window that we've launched under the INE, Innovation and Entrepreneurship scheme. And in that, I can't remember all the eligible activities. There's about 15. It ranges from, for example, if you, the example I gave, if you are a company developing some kind of a product, and you've been so far focusing on the domestic market, and you're now keen to explore an overseas market, either to something as simple as going to a very important B2B session, or a very important a fair, or you need to get a test quality certification without which the EU market won't have you, and that service is not available here, it's too expensive. Those are just some of the examples of what you can get money for. If you need to pay, if you're thinking of acquiring another company and you want to do some due diligence on that, it's too risky, you may not have done it. If you didn't have the money, you can get the money for that. It's a matching grant. There is a component that you need to put, but it's 30%.
Anushka, is this information available on the website?
All the information is, so I won't go into more detail.
Yes, because you can go and refer the website and get the information. Can we
sorry,
ask
just
another
very
question?
quickly, I think I'll take away the point you made that we haven't done enough to showcase these on startup-friendly channels.
Yeah.
I would love to, maybe Sachin, you can help me connect with suitable channels for that. Maybe we can get README and other platforms to do an article and link all of this. So you're right, that's a big takeaway. We have not done enough on the channels that startups use to get this word out there. So
but you see that's the mindset in government. You publish on the papers, and then you're clear. So Anushka is a person who can create that change on making this happen. So thank you for that comment. So last question.
Quick request of Anushka, I'd love to see the document, please. Tilak Disanayaka. And a question for Glenn, to ask this question about the double helix, where there is an enormous amount of commercially available components, technologies, materials out there that can be used by companies to develop products. So you don't need to collaborate with the university at all. And you see evidence of that. If you get a chance, please go see the all-electric supercar 100 meters from here, which is using only commercially available technologies. So can you speak to that kind of an ecosystem rather than one which is waiting for some a unique technology to come out when we have an amazing amount of components and things available already on the market?
Yeah, I think my general statement is time waits for no man. And it's ideas that drive invention and innovation, not the other way around. So I think, you know, there are clearly really smart people that are doing really interesting things with standard componentry. Yeah, I think that's the question, right? So you don't need innovation to create a disruptive offering. Is that your point? Yeah, so I'm not an advocate of necessarily of technologies that only come out of research centers. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned it, but one of the most successful technologies in our Accelerator Entrepreneurship Incubator is a woman who has a biodegradable, disposable shaving brush that's used in hotel chains in India as well as for tonsuring at the temples. And the technology is essentially a process for extracting fiber from the banana plant. And didn't come out of a research center, it came out of a village. She's employing now 120 women who are making these brushes, and they've been quite successful. So when I speak about, you know, the ecosystem, it's ecosystem with a capital E, right? So there are innovators who are innovating products and solutions based on standard componentry. There are research organizations that are doing development of products with new technology. In my mind, that's all equally viable with one caveat, that it's disruptive in nature and that the market cares about it. And if there's a market and it's disruptive and changes, if it's not a me too, and even to a certain extent there are iterative products that can be successful, but the runway is long, we're looking for disruptive innovations that have market potential, whether they come from cobbling together standard stuff, technology coming out of a village, or research coming out of a university or a private research center. It doesn't really matter.
We have 2 minutes more just to wrap the discussion up. Mangala, I will ask you for the final note. With all this discussion, what is the one important thing that the startups here and those who are aspiring to be startups can take home from this discussion? This is one important thing.
From this discussion, I think Anushka pointed out, I mean, they've created a great strategy and now hopefully will be actionized. So there is this website and there could be a lot of benefits. Please please use that. And then I just think we should pressure the government to get shit done. Don't just be passive. Keep them on their toes. I think that's what we should do, because we need certain things to move forward. We need that stability when we work with the global markets. We need to keep that pressure on. We can't just be passive and expect whatever, you know. That's what I think.
Great. So I think we'll come to a close. Thank you,
Can
panelists.
I just make one final comment as an expansion of that?
Comment, yeah.
I think that the message that you ought to take away from this event and from this discussion is that there are events and discussions happening. This is where the future is changed, is right here. What really happens that's really of import is not necessarily what happens on this stage. It's what happens amongst all of you as you build networks and as you then have one-on-one discussions and you continue to develop that, what we call a know-how network. And you've got some people here that could be part of your know-how network. So my hat is off to ICTA for putting this event together and allowing that discussion to take place in an open forum. So my
Thank you.
thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Anushka.
And thank you for
Madhya.
having me here.
I think it was a very, very good blend and a very good diversity that we had on stage and a very good discussion. Thank you once again.